All right, here we are, the last section of Political Transformations, Chapter 5, and it's going to be Asian Empires. So let's go ahead and move in here. So we've got making China an empire, Muslims and Hindus in the Mughal Empire, and Muslims and Christians in the Ottoman Empire. So let's look at this. The Chinese Empire ends up expanding not because they were being offensive, but more defensive. They were going out there. They didn't want anyone else to come in and take over. And so their best bet was to go ahead and expand their empire to help themselves stop other people from moving in. And so what they do is they expand it from this smaller China that we're used to seeing to the final imperial dynasty of the Qing Empire. And this is what we see. So we have the Taiping Rebellion, which is going to take place later in 1850. So we'll get to that too. But it shows the Manchu expansion, any tributary states. It shows this is basically before the Qing Empire. So look at how much they expanded. Quite a bit. And so that's going to be the borders that we see today. When you look at this image here, how would we know that this, how would we know that this is Imperial China? So what do we look at? So the first thing we can do is we can say, well, they look like they're posing for the picture, and they're dressed in silk. And we know that silk is a commodity that is considered luxurious. We can see her headwear looks like a crown of some sort. Him and his stylish shoes, a little bit ahead of the time. He is also dressed pretty fancy for a guy back in those days. So it kind of gives you an idea of and behind them they have the Chinese writing, so we know where this is coming from. So some royalty. All of this expansion is going to take the Qing Empire 80 years of military effort to bring these huge regions under control. This big area. It's a very large area, okay? One thing they did is they were very accommodating to all cultures. They viewed it not as a Chinese empire, but basically the expansion of their territory. They didn't assimilate the peoples. They didn't even govern them the same way that they governed the Chinese at the time. They basically were just in there and they're like, hey, they had the nomads that kind of resisted a little bit, but the Chinese knew them. They knew their territory. They let the natives govern their own area because it was cheaper for them. But they did govern them separately. So just kind of gives you some of the idea of how the Chinese grew and expanded their territory. Now, let's look at what we refer to as the Gunpowder Empires. Yes, they used gunpowder. They also used civility in some ways to retain their empires for as long as they did. So let's look at this empire. We have Suleiman the Magnificent, who brings the Ottoman Empire to its height. We have the Safavid Empire, started by Ismail and Shah Abbas. We have him in there. These are important players in these two empires. Now, this is one empire here. So let's look at this. This was once Persia, broken down into several empires. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk, we're going to start talking here with Shah Jahan. So let's look at Shah Jahan. He is a Mughal emperor, and remember, he is the one who built the Taj Mahal, this right here. He's the one who built the Taj Mahal for his wife Mumtaz Mahal when she died giving birth to their 14th child. He was known for his architecture, his ability to work with the Safavid and Ottoman empires. So he grew because of his ability to be diplomatic. He used diplomacy, and he was pretty understanding with other cultures. He did not care as far as religion. He didn't punish anyone for different religions. He wasn't as aggressive as his father, Suleiman, who was very aggressive and killed lots of people. So we go into Akbar. Akbar is the Mughal emperor that was well known for religious tolerance and for financially growing his empire. To him, leaders become great not because of their power, but their ability to empower others. One thing that is India is surrounded by trade. They have the Indian Ocean trade. They have the trans-Saharan trade. And because of that, they're always surrounded by trade. Well, in order to not be somebody who is always importing everything, he came along and said, that's fine, we'll trade, but you're going to have to buy some of our stuff too. So he kind of balanced out that trade that they had going in India, or in the Mughal Empire at the time. And then on to Aurangzeb. So we started with Shah Jahan. From Shah Jahan in the Mughal Empire, we go to Akbar. Akbar was awesome. Shah Jahan was awesome. And then we're going to go to Aurangzeb. Aurangzeb is going to be the one who brings down the empire. So Aurangzeb, when he came in, he did not like that women had all of these rights. It was actually kind of disturbing to him. He says that this isn't the way things should be. He institutes Sharia law. Now remember, a lot of people automatically associate Muslim faith with Sharia law. That's actually not accurate because it wasn't always there. It was not a foundation of Islam. It was instituted under Aurangzeb, who came in much later. And so obviously, if something is instituted later, not everybody in the religion is going to follow it. So Sharia law is one where women are not allowed to go anywhere by themselves. They must be accompanied all the time by somebody, a male in their family. Their eyes can only show. They're very adamant about chopping people's heads off. These are where you're going to see more of our ISIS people. He tried to keep the idea of religious tolerance that Akbar had started, but he said, that's fine if you don't want to follow our religion, but you'll pay a tax. The jizya tax is what people would have to pay. All of the things that he did, he is known for bringing the empire down.
Empires from 1450 to 1750. If you're into this kind of thing,
let me go back here. We were watching that earlier.
First kinds of people, territory that they had, and to expand into new territory. You see, these empires were pretty big, and they had a lot of territory and a lot of diverse kinds of people within them, and one way to keep them under control is to blow a few of them up now and then. And you see this kind of control especially in Russia, the Ottoman Empire, the Safavid Empire, and the Mughal Empire. At their core, these empires were fundamentally militaristic, but don't let that tempt you into thinking that they didn't also produce some magnificent cultures. They did, but even the art and architecture produced by these empires served the purpose of legitimizing the power of the ruler. But I get ahead of myself. We'll talk about that in the next video. For now, let's just look at some empires around the world and see by what means they expanded and developed. And first, let's start in Europe. By the mid-1400s, the devastation of the Black Plague was wearing off, and the population began to recover. Also, the 100 Years' War had come to an end, and you also had the invention of the Gutenberg printing press, which made the production of books and pamphlets much easier, and as a result, the European population began to experience an increase in literacy. Also, you may remember that in the previous period, Europe was just emerging from the feudalistic organization of their society. But in this period, that process really picks up steam. New monarchies began to arise all throughout Europe by the 1500s, and one of the key features of all these monarchies is that they began to centralize power. In feudalism, power was distributed throughout the territory and was largely in the hands of the landed elite. But in this period, kings began to gather up all that decentralized power and centralize it in themselves. And they did that by exercising control over taxation, control over the armed forces, and control over the religion of their state. And as a result of this consolidation of power, the bureaucracy expanded. Now, in these next few videos, I'm going to be throwing that word around a lot. Bureaucracy. Basically, a bureaucracy is just a group of government officials that carries out the will of whoever is in power. Now, I've been talking about all this in general, but if you want to throw a couple names on these new European monarchs, here's a few. You had the Tudors in England, you had the Valois in France, and you had Isabella and Ferdinand in Spain. And one little side consequence of all this consolidation of power is that the middle class begins to grow. And as it turns out, that happened at the expense of the nobility and the clergy. And since we're talking about Europe, let's talk about Russia. Russia's territory stretched from the east to the west, and therefore it was in a pivotal position to get wealthy on trade. Ivan IV was crowned Tsar in 1547 and later became known as Ivan the Terrible. You might say he was a fourth to be reckoned with. Now, Ivan was able to expand the Russian territory even further east and took much of the land that was held by the Mongolian Khans. Now, how did he do that? Gunpowder. Okay, let's move over to East Asia and see how they expanded their empires. The Yuan Dynasty, established by the Mongols, was overthrown in 1368 and was replaced by the Ming Dynasty, which held power in China well into the 1600s. Even so, the Mongolians were still a threat, and so it was the Ming state that restored and expanded the Great Wall of China. But right around the mid-17th century, another group called the Manchu from neighboring Manchuria seized power and established the Qin Dynasty in 1644. And under the leadership of Emperor Kangxi, the Chinese territory was significantly expanded into Taiwan, Mongolia, Central Asia, and Tibet. Wait, how did they do that? Gunpowder. Okay, now let's turn our attention to the rise of Islamic gunpowder empires. Now, in order to set the stage, let's reach back into the last time period. Let me introduce you to Tamerlane. Tamerlane was the Mongol Turkic leader of Samarkand. He was known for his ruthless invasions of Persia and India. In fact, some historians estimate that when Tamerlane invaded India, he killed up to 100,000 Hindus before the gates of Delhi. Now, Tamerlane's empire was heavily dependent on his military, and that was good and bad for him. It was good because he used the power of his military to stabilize and protect the comings and goings of merchants on the Silk Roads. But it was bad because that huge military ain't gonna pay for itself. And unfortunately, the enormous amounts of hooch that was required to keep that military operating eventually ravaged the economy and the empire fell apart. Okay, who cares? Tamerlane isn't in our period. That's true, but when his empire collapsed, three empires that you do need to know rose up out of its ashes. The Ottoman Empire, the Safavid Empire, and the Mughal Empire, and we're going to look at those each now. The Ottoman Empire was the largest and the greatest of all the Islamic empires during this time. It was established in the 1300s and lasted 600 years. So how did the Ottomans expand? Well, in 1453, under the leadership of Mehmed II, the Ottomans seized the crown jewel of Byzantine Christianity, Constantinople. And that was no small feat. Constantinople was well fortified with 3 layers of walls. So how did the Ottomans conquer that? Seriously? Do you still not know the answer? Was it gunpowder? Yes, it was gunpowder. Anyway, the Ottomans changed the name of that city to Istanbul, and they found that because it was at the nexus of all these different trade routes, they benefited tremendously. Now, it's generally agreed that the Ottomans peaked in... Wait a minute, what's the past tense of peak? Peaked? Poke? It's generally agreed that the Ottomans poke under the leadership of Suleiman the Great, who held power from 1520 to 1566. In 1526, Suleiman conquered Hungary and a slew of other territories, and he attempted to push further into Europe, but was thwarted. Nevertheless, this put some fear into the European britches. So how did Suleiman conquer so much territory? Diplomacy. Gunpowder. All right, let's check in with our friends in the Safavid Empire. The early hero of the Safavids was an empire by the name of Ismail. He conquered most of Persia, parts of Iraq, and here's the kicker. Ismail did all this when he was 14 or 15 years old. Hey, 15-year-olds watching this. What have you done with your life? And do I even need to tell you by what means Ismail conquered all this territory? Could you make it multiple choice? A, gunpowder. B, gunpowder. C, I hate you. A, gunpowder. That's correct, but I would have also accepted B or C. Now, another thing you need to know about the Shah Ismail is that he made Islam the official religion of his empire. But it wasn't just Islam. It was a particular form of Islam called Shia Islam. This had a way of uniting his empire, but while doing this, he denied legitimacy to any member of the other major branch of Islam, the Sunnis. And as it turned out, this caused frequent conflicts with the Ottomans, who just happened to be Sunnis. There were many conflicts between these two empires, but we'll get to that in another video. Okay, let's look at our friends in the Mughal Empire. In the 1520s, a guy named Babur, who was a descendant of Tamerlane, founded the Mughal Empire when India was in disarray. And in the middle of all this chaos, Babur completed conquest of northern India, gunpowder, and established a central government similar to Suleiman. Now, the greatest leader of the Mughal Empire was Akbar. Nope. Yep, and under his leadership, the Mughal Empire is one of the most prosperous and well-led states in all the world. And it shouldn't surprise you to know that all of these Islamic empires eventually fell. Without overloading you with details, it's sufficient to know that each of these empires declined basically because they failed to modernize their economies and their militaries. And compare this with the Europeans, who modernized like mad, especially their navies, and you've got a recipe for the downfall of those left behind. Okay, that's what you need to know about the development and expansion of land-based empires from 1450 to 1750. If you're into this kind of thing, then click here and subscribe, and I'll keep making...
Okay, we'll come back to the Mughals on another one. I want to go ahead and cover the Muslims and Christians in the Ottoman Empire. Obviously, that they are not going to be exactly agreeing here. So this is the Ottoman Empire, and It was brought to its height under Suleiman. Let me go out of here a little bit more. Well, if I could scoochie along on here and make it what I want. All right. Well, here's the Ottoman Empire. Kind of shows you how it expanded. The core Ottoman Empire is actually, to get honestly, this little bitty spot right there in the middle, the brown part of the Ottoman Empire under Suleiman is this green area that was at its height. These are tributary states under the Ottoman Empire. So they're states that actually kind of like they kind of controlled. So that was what you have under the Ottoman Empire. Very, very large. The Ottomans had the siege of Vienna in 1683. Basically, this painting here shows one of the sieges of Vienna here. And it has, in the late 17th century, this painting by Flemish artist Franz Jeffels. The last Ottoman incursion into the Austrian Empire is pushed back with French and Polish help, making it the end of a serious Muslim threat to Christian Europe. During this time period, this siege of Vienna is what stops the Ottoman Empire from expanding. Now, what happens during this time? Well, we have the Devshirme, which is where Muslims go in and take the Christian boys and they raise them up into the army, and they bring them. They give them high, if they can work their way up into the military, they can convert, and a lot of them do end up converting into Islam and convert to the Muslim faith. Here we have a book that I thought this picture was kind of interesting, talking about the Jihad, which is a holy war, people fighting for what they believe in. Here in the top image, they're using swords. It's kind of an older image, them fighting to spread their religion and to spread their territory. But this bottom one is actually ISIS. And this is more, actually, this one I think might be Al Qaeda, now that I think about it. But this group here is a little bit more extreme than the group at the top. And it shows you how they've changed over time. And that's what that book is actually about. So that kind of gives you an idea of what's going on throughout the Asian empires. If you were in class for this, I told you guys to go back and watch this on your own. I'm going to go ahead and play this really quick so we have it in the video.
Hi, I'm John Green. This is Crash Course World History, and today we're going to talk about the Mughal Empire. And we're also going to talk about the two most important Mughal emperors, Akbar and Aurangzeb, and how their historical reputations were made. Mr. Green, don't you mean the Mongol Empire? Oh, me from the past. That reminds me of the time that you conflated the word fort with the word forte, which of course you pronounced fort. But on this occasion, you aren't entirely wrong. The Mughals were kind of the Mongols, but we'll get to that in a minute. So the Mughals were Muslims who created an empire in India that held power for roughly 200 years between the early 16th and early 18th centuries, although technically the Mughal Empire didn't come to an end until after the Indian Rebellion against the British in 1857. Now, the Mughals weren't the first Muslims in India. Those would have been merchants, and they weren't even the first Muslims to rule significant parts of India. That honor goes to the Delhi Sultanate, which began in 1206 in northern India. But the Delhi Sultanate didn't last very long, and it was replaced by a bunch of regional kingdoms, and one of them, the Lodi Sultanate, had the misfortune of falling to the founder of the Mughal Dynasty, Babur, in 1526. Not Babar, although that would have been awesome. Babur was descended from Timur, the last great Central Asian conqueror in the Mongol tradition, and also from Chinggis Khan, which explains why Babur and his followers are called the Mughals. It's the Persian Arabic word for Mongols. Now, I know what you're saying, something like 12% of human beings currently living in the world are descended from Chinggis Khan, but Babur got it on the ground floor of it. Anyway, I think we have some footage of Babur raiding the Lodi Sultanate, don't we, Stan? Nah, I don't feel like that was actual file footage from 1206. I feel like that was a racist Hercules movie from Italy in the 1950s. So the Mughal Empire is really important in India's cultural history. I mean, the Taj Mahal was built during this time. In architecture and painting, we see a blending of Indian and Persian styles that demonstrate how cosmopolitan the empire was. But probably the most important aspect of the Mughals, at least as far as the contemporary world is concerned, is that they consolidated Muslim rule over much of India, and they're largely the reason that today there are so many Indians who are also Muslims. And the Mughals were also a really interesting example of how to build and maintain an empire. All right, let's go to the thought bubble. Muslims were a small minority ruling class, vastly outnumbered by Hindus, and like many empires, they relied on military power and pursued expansionist policies. Like most of the Mughal rulers, especially Akbar and Aurangzeb, spent a considerable amount of time trying to extend Mughal control over the entire Indian subcontinent, and they created a pretty effective empire. They were able to incorporate Indian princes into the ruling class while still retaining top positions for Muslims. They reorganized the bureaucracy and instituted an effective tax collection system, which was important because the empire was, of course, very expensive to run, as empires always are. This meant it was important to make accurate tax assessments, and taxes were usually collected by local leaders called zamindars. Taxes had to be paid in cash, and this contributed to the growing commercialization of the Mughal Empire. Reliance on zamindars, who were important men in their communities, meant that the empire could collect revenue without being too disruptive to local village life. And although almost all of the revenue came from taxes on agriculture, the Mughals also taxed trade. Another way that the Mughals were a typical empire is that their rulers engaged in building projects to enhance their prestige. From Persepolis to Rome to the Forbidden City, building monuments to one's greatness is what emperors do, and the Mughals were no exception. As Muslims, many of their building projects were mosques, but the Mughals also built forts and, most spectacularly, mausoleums. Thanks, Thought Bubble. So most history classes that mention the Mughals focus on the contrast between Akbar and Aurangzeb. Akbar comes off as a good ruler, and Aurangzeb is painted as the guy who ruined the empire. The typically positive historian's view of Akbar, who ruled from 1556 until 1605, can be summed up in this quote from Asher and Talbot's India Before Europe. Through his reforms of administration and taxation, Akbar created a sound and enduring foundation for Mughal governance, while his tolerant attitude and inclusive policies toward Hindus and Jains helped create a state that was more Indian in character. That tolerance aspect is especially important. Like, Akbar rescinded the jizya, the tax that non-Muslims had to pay, and in 1580 he gave all non-Muslims the same rights as Muslims, instituting a policy called sul-i-kul, which translates to universal toleration. Now, in part, this policy was designed to lessen the power of Muslim religious scholars who might have been disturbed by the way that Akbar blended Islamic and Indian ideas of kingship, especially the idea that he was, kind of a little bit divine. Slightly problematic idea to a lot of Muslim scholars, given that the foundation of the Islamic faith is the statement, there is no God but God. But In addition to the sul-i-kul, Akbar built his reputation for toleration by sponsoring discussions of religion and philosophy. He even commissioned a building for religious discussions, the Ibadat Khana, where Muslims and Brahmins and Zoroastrians, Jains, Christians, all of them could talk theology. Akbar's support for intellectual pursuits are the kinds of things that modern historians like, and it's not all that surprising that he's remembered so favorably. Historians are far less kind to Akbar's grandson, Aurangzeb, who ruled from 1658 until 1707. This is partly due to the work of J.N. Sarkar, who promoted the idea that Aurangzeb built an Islamic state that discriminated against Hindus and other non-Muslims, which in turn led to a loss of unity across the Indian subcontinent and eventually the decline of the empire. And it's true that by the time of Aurangzeb's death in 1707, the Mughals were losing control over their empire. I mean, the stark reality of that decline came in 1757 when the British East India Company established itself permanently in Bengal and began its inexorable efforts to colonize all of India. But that was, 50 years after Aurangzeb died, so maybe he shouldn't get all of the blame. In fact, whether these guys deserve their reputations really depends both on what aspects of their reign you look at and how you interpret them. As conquerors, Akbar and Aurangzeb had a lot in common. Like, Akbar might have sponsored high-minded discussion, but he was also willing to use extreme violence to keep his subjects in line. For example, he slaughtered thousands of inhabitants of the fort at Chittor and ordered his generals to pile up the skulls of Indian princes to frighten them into submission. That's not especially tolerant. And here's another detail about Akbar's rule that's meant to paint him as a modern enlightened ruler. Because he was interested in science, Akbar arranged an experiment. He had infants moved to a special house where no person was to talk to them so that the natural language of mankind might be revealed. The experiment failed, but it is a reflection of Akbar's desire to explore in a scientific manner the nature of humans and what he believed to be their common condition. Now, you can read that as a leader trying to understand the underlying connections among all humans, no matter their religious backgrounds, or you can read it as horrifying child abuse. And then we have Aurangzeb, who was a devout Muslim and did try to introduce Islamic principles into Mughal rule, but the trend toward orthodoxy and away from Akbar's toleration had begun long before with his predecessor, Shah Jahan. He's best known for building the Taj Mahal. Good work, Stan. He built it by himself? Apparently he had some help. But the maintenance of the Taj Mahal took all the revenue from 30 villages, and maybe Aurangzeb's orthodoxy was less important than his desire to appear to be a sober and frugal leader. Aurangzeb was also accused of destroying temples in 1669, although in fact they were just damaged, and this was primarily done to send a political message to opponents, not as an act of religious orthodoxy. He also tried to limit expenses at court by prohibiting the use of gold in men's garments, and he stopped the traditional practice of being weighed against gold on his birthday. Unlike Akbar, who is seen as being a patron of the arts, Aurangzeb is remembered for getting rid of court musicians and poets, but he got rid of them because of financial constraints. Well, and also because of his interpretation of Islamic law, and that last point interests me. For those who want to see him negatively, Aurangzeb's orthodox Islam had no room for musicians or poets. But it's also possible to see that decision as a prudent cost-saving measure. Here's another detail from Aurangzeb's life that's been used to paint him as a zealot. Aurangzeb, unlike his predecessors, was buried in a simple outdoor grave rather than an elaborate and expensive tomb. You could see that as a symbol of religious faith, or as a sign of humility, or an attempt by a thoughtful ruler to spare his subjects the expenses of, keeping up his tomb. That said, in the long run, the Taj Mahal has done pretty well in terms of generating tourist money, whereas I don't think anyone's paying to see Aurangzeb's grave. But the thing is, Aurangzeb needed to save money. If he was a bad ruler, it's mostly because he spent so much time and treasure fighting rebellions in the south of his empire, and then neglected the north, where unrest grew as well. It's overly simplistic to say that the glory days of the Mughal Empire were about tolerance, and the downfall was about intolerance. Really, there were lots of factors that played into the decline of the Mughal Empire, including growing factionalism at the Mughal court, the rise of regional powers, and the breakdown of the system of governance by local nobles. Historians are in the business of making claims about what happened and supporting those claims with evidence, and often this evidence provides the details that make reading and learning about history so much fun. Now, sometimes the details suggest only one interpretation, but in many cases they can lead us to multiple conclusions. And the reigns of Akbar and Aurangzeb provide good examples of why we need to be careful with our details. It's possible that Aurangzeb was a terrible ruler because he tried to impose Muslim orthodoxy on a Hindu majority, and no doubt many Hindus felt so, especially after he reinstituted the jizya, and he did try to introduce Sharia law as the governing principle in the empire. But it's also possible that Aurangzeb's bad reputation comes from a contemporary preference for tolerance over piety in our rulers, or from a general feeling that states are better ruled by secular than religious laws, or from the fact that it's just hard to rule a declining empire well. Ask President Obama. Our experiences and biases make us more likely to...
Okay. We're going to go ahead and end that. I'm not really sure what's going on there, but we're going to go ahead and end that at that part. It's almost over. So